Hello everyone. I'm just doing a quick check. Can everyone hear me properly? Is the video working? Can you guys hear me? Can everyone hear me at all? So there's definitely a delay. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a lot of it right now. Awesome. Okay. So that's good. Sweet. Okay, so this time, I think with this live stream, I'm going to do more of a ask me anything style, like a live chat. So if you guys have any specific questions, you can ask me. I know in the last one, if you guys didn't get a chance to catch it, I did a very set topic, which was on getting a job, like your first job, navigating your first year in the software industry. And I didn't really take too much time to take any questions from the chat. But this time, I think I'll do that. I'll just make sure that I answer any questions that anybody has regarding anything. Otherwise, I did just recently go through some Google engineering interviews that I can give everyone some insight into. I also did some Facebook ones. And for all of those ones, at the very least, I got to the last round, and they were all for San Francisco. But the problem was that my degree is not in computer science, and immigration recently in the Trump administration has been very strict, to say. So the immigration teams, unfortunately, had to pause my interviews once I got to those last rounds. And then they had to, we were in the process of moving me over to a different interview process for the same organizations, except in Europe, where the visa restrictions are a little bit less strict. So that's at the very least what Andre was talking about with those Google interviews. But if anyone's curious, I can talk more about kind of like what that process is like, what preparing for that process is like. I know a lot of people are interested in getting into FAANG companies. So I can talk about that, or we can just talk about, like general job stuff, React stuff, anything regarding tech, maybe even like how everyone's dealing with this current stay-at-home thing that everyone's going through. So it's pretty open. If anybody has any specific questions they want answered right now, I can definitely answer some. If not, I'm just going to go right into talking about, I see here Mukesh has a question about how to land your first job in React. So I can start with that question. So when it comes to getting your first job in React, most companies that pick up React have been working on it at this point for quite some time. And you can kind of categorize companies into either companies that already have a product or companies that are looking to start a new product, like net new with React. That kind of changes what you need to, I guess, bring to the table. And when it comes to, let's just start with the first one, which is companies that already have a React product and they've been working on it for some time. So let's say that you apply for this company, and when you ask them, the first question you'd ask is, what stack are you currently on? And depending on what they tell you, they should also tell you how old their React stack is. You should then be asking questions like, how, are you using hooks? Are you using sagas? What's the underlying ecosystem technologies that you've pulled into your React program? Based on that, you should then prepare what kind of questions you need to be able to answer based on what technologies they're using. For example, if they're using sagas, they might want to know that you have some idea of what sagas are. Most of the time when you're talking about going for a React-based company, they just want to know, do you have experience in the technology that they're using? So other than that, that's kind of like what it's like for those companies that already have existing React projects. They're probably less interested in hooks unless they explicitly say so, just because for a company that's been building their technology for so long in, like sagas, Redux, whatever they already have so far, it's difficult for them to pivot. So I know right now, hooks is really hot and everyone's doing hooks, right? Even for a lot of my new projects, have done hooks just because it's much easier to get started with. You don't really need that much complex technologies baked in if you don't really have anything like that. But, like generally speaking, most large corporate companies that you're trying to join will probably already be pretty stuck into Redux and sagas or observables. It really depends. So that's one thing with React. If you're looking for a company that's starting net new, you should probably figure out, do they want to do hooks, right? And what are they looking for in terms of background experience? Because if they're starting from net new, you got to make sure that this company has somebody who already knows how to architect the application. If you don't, then you might... It depends on the hiring manager, because if the hiring manager for a newer company just is looking for somebody that has experience, doesn't need anyone with that much experience, there's a chance that you can actually get that job. You might actually get the role, and they might put all that responsibility onto you, meaning that they might want you to build the application from scratch in React, which is really difficult, right? If you're architecting an app for the very first time, there's a lot of decisions that's going to be very stressful for you to make. You'll definitely learn a lot. Don't get me wrong. It's a great thing. And if the employer knows that that's the situation and they still proceed, then that's good if you're willing for that kind of challenge. Otherwise, I would say that there's a lot of, things that you got to be aware of there. In terms of finding a job, honestly, a lot of finding React jobs is just about applying for front-end developer roles. They really care not that much on whether or not you have a portfolio. I'm going to be honest, because most engineering managers, when they're hiring, at least in North America, they might just look at your GitHub and they probably will look at your experience. Now, if you don't have experience, then they might look at your portfolio at the very least once they've gone through all the candidates that have experience. This is kind of just the way that it goes, but that's why it's a numbers game, right? You just apply for as many companies as you can and you show off some of your projects. Now, when it comes to computer science degree, so it's not harder, definitely not harder to get a job with comp sci. What you learn in a comp sci degree is very nuanced for scalability. It's like very academic related questions when it comes to like scaling systems. It doesn't necessarily teach you how to code properly or any of the best practices or even how to develop like a website. Most of a computer science degree is the academic side of computer science, which is kind of like solving these really nuanced computer science questions using optimal, data structures and algorithms and trying to figure out how to reduce the amount of time it takes to maybe something like sort really large sets of data, right? So unless you're going for a really big company like Google or Amazon or Facebook or Netflix, not having the degree won't really change anything for you. Now, if you are going for those big companies, that becomes definitely something that helps, because if you've never done data structures and algorithms before, you will have to learn them just to apply for these big FANG companies, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple being the other one, Uber, Twitter, right? All these big tech firms, they all expect you to know what you would learn in a comp sci degree. So that's the only time where comp sci is important. Now, for that question about like computer engineer versus versus developer, software developer is just good at building maybe websites or backends. Computer engineer needs to know how to scale large data sets. That's probably the main difference. A lot of companies kind of have an overlap there. They don't really distinguish it. In some companies where you're an engineer, you are a developer at another company. Like your responsibilities might not change at all. So in terms of that, don't worry too much about the specific role. Again, the only places where they're very strict are these big tech firms where they're tech first, right? Those companies are the only ones that really emphasize that the engineering side of it matters. And the engineering is data structures and algorithms. Now, if you, let's see. Okay, so Vue.js, a lot more opportunities. So Vue is great in the sense that Vue is very lightweight and there's a lot of demand in Asia because Vue. So Evan Yu, I actually had a great chance to speak to him because he came to our company in Toronto, the one that Andre and I are from, and he did a full day workshop with us, and he told us about the future of Vue, and this was about 2 years ago. So Vue has really mainly scaled in China because with Vue, Evan has a really large presence in like Asia. He almost translates all documentation into Chinese when it came to Vue. So there's a lot of pickup for Vue with, a lot of small companies, and he does a lot of circuits when it comes to doing talks. So other than that, like I would say that the opportunities in Vue are big in Asia, not as large in North America and Europe. There's some, but it's very contested. That's probably what I would say. Because a lot of people like Vue. It's very fun to work with. So you're going to be competing with a lot of developers who are experienced and want to work with Vue. That would be the only thing. That's why I would say I would transition from Vue to React if it comes to getting your first job. So that's probably the big thing I would say. Here's some questions about React and Redux with hooks. So hooks can replace Redux. Hooks don't replace Sagas. Sagas is a middleware for Redux that allows you to do asynchronous actions and activity in your app through Redux. So that's a big thing when it comes to hooks. Hooks is good if you don't need to build a really large application. Most of the time, Redux is really much more tested. So if you were to, if you were to replace Redux with hooks and context, for example, if you did that, you would essentially be building something similar to the Redux library from scratch. And really, there's no point in doing that unless you just need a very lightweight state management service. But for most applications that are large, hooks is not enough. Hooks might be a good way to stop using class components, which has a lot of benefits because if you switch over to functional components, which is the only way that you can use hooks, you can't use hooks in class components, then they're good because functional components are easier to test, but you do have to test your hooks. And testing hooks is a little bit complex, just like testing classes was when it came to lifecycle methods. So that's the only thing. I would say that learning hooks is good for personal projects, small projects, but using it for large-scale projects, it's still relatively new. And unless you're working at somewhere like Facebook, which has really pushed what that standard of using hooks is like, that's going to be a problem, right? Because you don't really know if the companies have an idea of what the best practices with hooks are. And hooks are constantly changing in the way that they're kind of being implemented and used for a lot of features. There's a lot of things, like even when Matt and I built the new Zero to Mastery website, we used hooks, and there are certain pitfalls that become really apparent when you try and build features where you have like tagging, searching, filtering all in one component, and separating them out and make sure that the hooks don't conflict or do the things that you want to. is not the easiest thing to do because the documentation and the feature set for it is kind of new still. So there's a couple things that I would say. For the course, yes, I update the course constantly. If there's anything new, I definitely make sure to update the course so that it stays the most relevant and it provides the most value for students when it comes to understanding what it is that you're going to work on in a actual job with React. I think that's the big thing. With my course, I'm really just trying to teach you all of the things that you will need to know, whether it be decision making, the libraries, the ecosystem, the patterns, the best practices of doing React on the job in a large company, a middle-sized company, or a small company. You got to think about all of the architecture and, when to pull in what library, why am I using this library, why am I using this pattern, what problems are we solving, right? Those are the main things that my React course will teach you. Let's see. Hold on. Let me see a different question. Yes, you can use anything you build in my course, you can definitely use in your portfolio. I have no problem about that. Absolutely. That's actually the main point for why we created this course, was so that you had a big project that you could show off to employers and be like, hey, look, listen, I've done pretty much everything that you would probably do in a large company. Now, there's nuances here about like what might, what kind of features you might expect with sagas or something, but those are more particulars, right? They can't expect you to have done exactly the same thing in their product than you would in a general product. Slightly different question. People say instead of watching courses and following exact examples, we should try and build our own projects. At what point are we ready to start? So this concept of readiness is really difficult. You will almost never feel ready because at any point we always feel like we can improve. I'm almost 6 years into my career and I still feel like there's room for improvement. Even, for example, when I was doing my Google interviews, right? I had never done data structures and algorithms before. So I spent a lot of time refreshing myself, learning it, and just getting really into it for like a year. I just completely dedicated all my time to learning data structures and algorithms and cracking the interview process, right? And then I applied it to all these big FAANG companies and it worked. So like, even when I applied though, I wasn't fully certain whether or not I was ready. But once I did it, I was 100% sure that, as I was doing the process, as I was going through these interviews, I was like, oh, you know what? My process is perfectly good. Because I got a lot of extremely positive feedback from these big tech companies too, that, they were saying, oh, this guy's like meant for this role. And it was a pretty senior position. So there were definitely kind of like, you kind of just get these signs as you do as you work on it that you'll understand. And this translates to doing a project as well. So when it comes to, doing a project, like whether or not you feel like you're ready to build your own project, it depends on the size of the project, really, right? If you feel like you've done enough tutorials that you have a basic idea of how to build something, then just start doing it. And it's not like as you do it, you're going to just magically know what to do at every step. You're going to constantly have to go back to tutorials, go back to documentation. You're going to have to read people's, posts on, what's that website called? Stack Overflow, right? Just to see how you completely capture, a feature that you're trying to build when you don't really know how to start, right? Those are perfectly fine. That's kind of how you're going to go through building a project. So when it comes to TypeScript, I really like TypeScript on Enterprise. TypeScript to learn in a course is really confusing. If I were to teach TypeScript in my React course, it would have added probably 10 to 15 additional hours. And TypeScript in itself, you almost have to learn. You have to learn TypeScript before you learn React. It would just be so much additional stuff and configuration like coding that you would have to get used to. So I didn't teach TypeScript or Flow. I actually like thought about it for a really long time about including TypeScript. And honestly, it's good. I am a big fan of TypeScript, but I would not worry about adding TypeScript to React until after you've done some work in React. So let's see. CSS on the job. So CSS is important for any front-end developer. You don't need to be, great at styling, but you should at least know how to generally solve it. And when I say generally, I mean like you don't need to know CSS grid, but you should know Flexbox. And your CSS should be relatively responsive. Like you should know mostly what the ways to make a responsive website will be. I wouldn't say that it's probably that important compared to your JavaScript knowledge, because to be honest, in the development world, this isn't like, how it should be, but it is what it is. Most people see CSS and HTML as kind of lesser languages, and most of your value as a developer is all put in how well you understand JavaScript. Because JavaScript's complex, and JavaScript is kind of where the most complex of your features get built. So when it comes to that is the big thing with your CSS. You should just know enough of it, but you don't need to, you don't need to go overboard. So JavaScript is going to be your main selling point. So let's see. Okay, so let's talk about the Google interview. My Google interviews were good because I know somebody in Google. So if you're even thinking about applying for these big tech companies, like FAANG companies in the first place, you want to know somebody in there, because otherwise it's really hard for people to, even just get an interview. It's like a very low percentage. But like, as long as you know somebody, they value that really highly. If you know somebody in the company and they give you a referral, you have a practically guaranteed chance to get the first interview, which is just going to be a phone screen. So for these interviews, you need to do a lot of prep. And not only do you have to do a lot of prep where you have to like really understand data structures and algorithms, but you have to really make sure you've mastered the process of doing these questions. So when it came down to doing these questions, the type of questions you're going to get asked are questions you can see on this website called LeetCode, LeetCode. If any of you are curious, I suggest you take a look at it just to see an example of the types of questions that you will get asked, because what you've done in front-end development practically doesn't translate at all into data structures and algorithms. Data structures and algorithms are very much like optimization questions, where they'll give you a question like, if I were to give you a really long string and then I gave you a smaller string, I want you to find me the how many times that smaller string occurs in that larger string. And it might ask you if that smaller string shows up unbroken or broken, meaning that, let's say our big string is a lot of characters, whatever, like picture just a really long string, right? Let's say like 500 characters. And let's say your small string is ABC. They might ask you, find all occurrences of ABC in that longer string where ABC are together. Or they might say, find all occurrences of ABC in that string where you might be allowed 1 or 2 spaces between any of the characters. So that's like a thing you have to keep in mind, right? So, and this is just one type of question. There are hundreds of questions, thousands of questions, but categorically there's maybe like 14, 15 categories of types of questions. So a lot of it is just going to be around learning the proper algorithms, the proper techniques, the proper mindset framework of how to solve these problems. Honestly, like interviewing for these FAANG companies is a big category in itself. It's a topic in itself. So let's see. For my Google interview, I did it on JavaScript. They're very open about what languages you might want to use. So for me, I did JavaScript. So when it comes to showing off your core, like, projects from courses on GitHub, generally speaking, companies don't really go that far to check whether or not, the project you've done is a copy of another one. They won't really know. And even if they do, they're still going to say, okay, the pro is that if this guy or girl has this on their GitHub, if it's impressive, I'm still going to ask them how well they understand what it is that they coded. So you got to make sure that even if you have it on your GitHub account, you need to know and show that you understand what you've written. So that's the big thing. So, that's why the tutorials that give you projects are not necessarily a bad thing, because, you really get to brush up and make sure you understand every piece of the code that was written in this project that you have. Afterwards, they might ask you, have you done anything to modify this project? And this is where I would say, build some of your own features using what you've learned, right? And try and make it a more complex or your own thing. There's actually a great number of examples of students who have done that with the e-commerce application that we built in the React application, in the React course. And that was really impressive. That was really great because you see them implement Google Maps API. There's just all these things that they've done using the Saga knowledge and the Redux knowledge to build features that you would see also. So that's a big thing. As for, let's see, in which language? Substring, Fullstack developer. Okay, so Fullstack developers, Fullstack is getting more popular with small companies. So small companies like startups will want you to know Fullstack because it's easier for them to hire one person than to hire 2 or 3 people. The problem with Fullstack is that at large companies will not expect you to do a Fullstack role. They might expect you to know general Fullstack knowledge where you're more heavily leaning towards one category. Like at some point they want you to at least know how Node works, right? Like how a backend works, like what an API, how to write like a decent API. But they might expect you to have really extensive experience in front-end technologies. So that's like one big thing that you should know about Fullstack is that like up front, like if you're new, if you're trying to get to your first year of experience and you want to go for a Fullstack role, that's okay. You can do it. Companies will probably hire you. Just understand these are going to be probably smaller companies, and the workload is that you're going to have to learn a lot of complicated things. It will give you a lot of solid knowledge in how the front end and the back end connect and what a good project altogether looks like from front to back. But for some people, that's not a good way for them to learn, but for others it is. It really depends on what you prefer. So it's an open-ended question because it's really about what you yourself prefer to do. Do you like to zero in on one particular place and learn it well? Or do you like to learn the whole thing, right? Everything as a whole, especially in this environment where we've segmented backend and front end separately. Fullstack always gains popularity, then loses popularity, then gains popularity, then loses popularity. And even then, it still depends because some frameworks are designed as Fullstack frameworks, like Ruby on Rails, for example. So if you go to a Ruby on Rails company, they prefer some Fullstack experience. Whereas if you go to a company that has a dedicated backend, but they have a front-end application, then you're either backend or front-end or DevOps. So those are kind of the things. Let's see. So how do you get a recommendation from a Google employee? This is a little hard because you need to have worked with them before. So one of my close friends that I also worked with is Hussein Dejurde. So he is somebody who is on the web Chrome team. And him and I worked very closely for 2 years. So I had a great rapport. You know, we had built a lot of great projects together. So he gave me a very good recommendation. So that's kind of the thing. You do need somebody who knows you if you're going to go that route. Otherwise, just apply, right? If you don't have a recommendation, what you can do is try and see on Twitter or on social media when people are putting out hiring messages, right? For these companies, try and see if they're willing to at least give you like the recommendation in the sense that they've, maybe you guys speak on Twitter a little bit or something, right? Like it's hard because like the only way to get a Google recommendation is you got to know somebody in Google, and you got to really know them, because when they make the referral for you, Google asks, how well do you know this person? How have you worked with them before? And in the people that you've worked with, where do they rank, right? Generally speaking, they gotta be willing to say this person's in the top 5% of developers I've worked with. And if they don't give you that much recommendation, even with a referral, you might not get the interview. So that's kind of the big thing. So that's the big thing about Google interviews, and getting them at the very least. Getting them is hard. I would just say, honestly, the big thing is just apply. If you don't have the referrals, still apply, right? There's always a basket. It's small. It's like 2% of all of the candidates that they see. But those are going to be the ones that they pick from for just getting an interview, because they still got to fill their headcount. Let's see. So how do you stay motivated to continue your journey in this field, and what makes you want to be part of this field at the first place? So honestly, the big thing with this field is that staying motivated is definitely difficult for anything that's hard. Because anything that's hard is worth doing, but it's hard to begin with. I would say try and just figure out a way to make sure that you're working on it every day in a different capacity. You don't have to go 100% on it every single day. Some days you might be overwhelmed and only work on it, 30, 40, 50 minutes. But the idea is you want to do it every day, because you want to keep that streak going, and you want to build that mental model that every day I'm part of this field. I'm part of software. I'm working on some code, or I'm reading some documentation, or I'm reading news about the stuff. It doesn't matter, as long as you spend some time every single day reading or learning or working on software stuff. So that's the big thing about staying motivated. You have to almost convince your brain that this is something that I'm invested in, and I will continue to be invested in. I'll continue to put the time. And it's really hard, because I felt exactly the same way as everyone here did as well when they first started, right? It's really overwhelming. It seems like there's so much to learn. It's such an intimidating field. Everything is so difficult. But those years will fly by, and you'll look up, and 5 years from now you'll be like, wow, I've got 5 years of experience. I've like gone through a lot of this stuff. I've met some great people. I've worked on some amazing projects, right? And really that's just what it is. Like, you want to be interested in what you work on as well. So that's a really big thing. So okay, front end and back end is not okay. So in FANG companies, they don't consider front end worse than back end, but they expect you to know both in the sense that they expect you to be a generalist. That doesn't mean you have to know like back end code, but you should know how it works. I wouldn't say that you have to have the same amount of experience in both, but you should definitely know how back end behaves, right? You should understand DevOps. You should understand system design. But it depends on what level you're going at. If you're going at the lowest level, you don't need to know system design. But if you're going at a higher level, anything higher than the initial level. So let's take Google, for example. Google breaks up their company from L3 to L9. L3 is like the lowest level you can come in at. L9 is the highest, and it's like super rare that anybody's even at L9. I think there's maybe like 2 or 3 people that are L9 in Google. And at L3, you are either like 1 or 2 years experience or fresh out of university, right? That's kind of what they go for that category of L3. There, you won't be asked system design questions. You're going to be given general data structure algorithm questions, but they will ask you, what do you want to do? Do you want to work on a front-end team, or do you want to work on a back-end team? What's your experience mostly lie in? They aren't looking to say that one is worse than another. Honestly, they need both roles to be filled. But for a company like Facebook, actually, they don't do a system design interview if the majority of your experience is in front end. Instead, they give you a product design interview. It's not dissimilar oh, sorry. It's not dissimilar, but it's definitely still like you have to learn a lot of these more high level concepts about how a product is designed, how a tech product comes together, all of the pieces in terms of honestly production development. Where if we were to launch a product at scale, what does the system look like? Where are you in where are you putting servers? Where are you stemming the flow? What's the way a feature is going to work and communicate with the backend? Like it gets really complex from a high level, and that's what you would need to know if you wanted to do Fang. Next.js, no, I haven't. I didn't have any plans to do anything with server-side rendering, but if there's enough demand, I can do it. I've done a couple of server-side rendering projects at scale. I just think it's less common, and I want everyone here to get their first job. So I want you to, I want to give you content that will get you to that first job and equip you as fast as possible. So that's probably the big thing. Let's see. How many hours does it take for junior dev work? So work-life balance is really up to the individual and the environment that you're in. I don't want to use a blanket term and say that you should always value work-life balance if you're somewhere where everybody works a lot, because it's hard, right? Like we all want to say work-life balance is the right thing to have. But in this industry, it's lucratively competitive and there's a lot of money, at least pre-corona. Right now, corona's kind of making people scared a little bit, but generally speaking, this industry is booming. It's like the gold rush of our generation. So everyone wants in on this industry. This means that the people that are in it to really build something great or, make a lot of money. So if you are looking for work-life balance, you got to go to a company that values that in their engineers. It's been proven that burning out engineers is unproductive. But at the same time, a lot of companies have gotten where they are by burning out their engineers, because there's the business side and then there's the code quality side, and they're not necessarily tied together. Just because you produce a lot of quality code does not mean that your product is going to go into the market and succeed. And at the end of the day, this is a business. So when it comes to business, a lot of companies, and you'll notice if you've ever worked in enterprise in any capacity, there are a lot of code bases that are almost written very, very badly. Like it's like just patched together. Most people don't really know how certain parts of the application work, but they're massive enterprises, enormous companies, because they got to the market fast. So that's the big thing. You might have to do work where you have very poor work-life balance. You're working a lot of hours, but like at the same time, you got to want that, and you got to see that perhaps might be the stepping stone for you, right? Like a lot of it comes down to a lot of companies really just want to see whether or not you can produce like what you say you'll produce. So let's say there's a feature. It might take somebody 8 hours and it might take another person 2 hours. If the person that it takes 2 hours is consistently putting out these features, then they can have some work-life balance, because just the amount of time they take to work on those features is less. But if the company expects the same out of both people, then the first person that takes 8 hours to build the feature is going to spend way, way more time working in the same week, because they have to put out the same amount of features, right? So it really just depends. So that's like a thing that you have to consider when it comes to work-life balance. I know it's a hard topic, but it is a big thing. How many hours at work do you do actual coding? Do you crunch code for almost 8 hours a day? Is it normal to have difficulties coding and maintaining focus after 4 hours or so? Absolutely. So I mostly work for myself, right? I have a lot of my own projects, or I do some contracting work, or I build courses. The big thing is that I spend most of my day I actually spend most of my day coding, but that's because like for me, like the actual coding, you have to remember, the more experience you get, you'll notice that the majority of code is boilerplate, or you're just rebuilding the same features you've already built before. So for me, for example, I can implement a search feature very fast. It might take me a lot of time because it's a complicated feature considering all the things, but there's not that much additional learning that I have to do with it. I don't have to like rack my brain learning this new thing. The first time I did it might have taken me like 2 weeks to 3 weeks to make sure that the feature was well built. But now it might take me 3-4 days, right? Where I'm coding, for the 8 hours, but it's like, it's less demanding on me mentally. So that's like a big thing to keep in mind when it comes to, what you're doing with, the amount of time you're coding. In the beginning, it's difficult because, you're staring at a screen perhaps for the first time in your life for like 10 hours. You're looking at a lot of code that you're not used to. You're learning a lot of concepts. You're holding a lot of new ideas in your brain, and that will cause you to fatigue really easily. So it's perfectly normal to lose that focus. And everyone has off days, right? A lot of people have off weeks. Some people just like, some weeks, you're just not mentally productive enough to do a lot of work. And that's perfectly normal too. That's just the nature of how, working in the software industry is and coding. So don't feel bad if you can't maintain focus after 4 hours. Like, take a break. I absolutely say, like, take a break. A lot of companies actually suggest that you take a break. I would say that in a day, maybe you have 4 or 5 hours of good productive work. Anything more is, you start maybe writing worse code than you would if you had a fresh mind state. So that's a big thing. Freelancer work is difficult to say. So I will say I've done some freelance work. Freelance work is great if you have clients from your own network. If you're just trying to do like Upwork, or if you're trying to do like, those more forum type websites where you're just picking off projects, like it's much worse. You have to make that trade-off. Do you want that experience, right? Because they don't pay that well. And generally speaking, there's a couple people that dominate those websites. Whereas if you already have a network and in this network, people are looking for, freelance work, and you've showed them before, you've worked with them before, and they trust you, then freelance is great. Because you get to work on your own hours, you get to work on your own project, you get to pick the projects you work on. But honestly, to get to that point, it's difficult, right? You need experience, you need exposure, you need network. A lot of it comes down to you need to have that experience or network in the first place. So why are algorithms considered in the interview when you hardly use them in a job? At these large FAANG companies, you may actually use them to some degree. But the thing is that data structures and algorithms, it's almost like a glorified intelligence test. Kind of. It's half intelligence test, half academic. Because for a company like Google or Facebook or Apple or Amazon, they're launching products to hundreds of millions of people, which means a feature might see massive load of data and use, which means that this feature that you're building absolutely needs to scale. They cannot have it go down. In fact, I don't think Amazon's gone down for like an hour in the last year. You know what I mean? It has like practically 100% uptime. So when it comes to that, they absolutely demand that you know what you have to do in order to make a product scalable or a feature scalable. And scalability is where data structure and algorithm like shine. Knowing an algorithm about how to make sure that a string is, searched through in the most optimal way, that comes up in a situation maybe when you're building something with searching strings. Like if you didn't need to do it, then honestly, like there's no use, because if you're building like, a front end application on a company where you're mainly just building, like buttons or cards, or you're architecting pages, you don't really need to know these algorithms. But when you're working on large scale features and, these companies want you to be a generalist, meaning that if they need to pull like 50 people off of a series of projects and put them on something new, they need to know that everybody there knows how to scale the product if you suddenly get put into a backend position. That's why the algorithms are important. So that's a big thing to keep in mind. Let's see. About every language, you just focus on one particular language. Honestly, zero in on one language. There's no, okay, so this is a question about should we have experience with multiple languages or just one particular language? Just master one language first, because a lot of those skills that you learn in terms of best practices will come from just mastering one language. A lot of those are transferable. With a new language, you might just be learning syntax, but the ideas might get reconfigured a little bit, but it's pretty much going to be the same thing. You already know how to communicate, or you already know how to make code do what you want to do. You already know how to do it in a scalable way where you got the best practices down. So I would definitely say like focus on one particular language and get really good at that first before you branch off into something else. Can we get a good job straight out of college with no prior experience in FANG, even when they don't visit our campus? You can, but you have to make sure that your grades are high and that you have some way of putting yourself in front of that company. So the big thing when it comes down to getting a job out of college is that you have to make sure that you have a lot to offer. And the only way that they can gauge whether you have a lot to offer is how well you did in school. It's unfortunate, but it's true, right? Now, if you have a couple of years of experience, now your grades don't really matter. In fact, many companies have, like these big companies have done researches on whether or not your grades correlate to your performance, and it doesn't. But the problem is that when you're coming fresh out of university, they're not really testing for that. They might not even give you the interview. Because you got to remember with these interviews, they're like funnels, right? The biggest funnel is at the very top when everyone's applying in. They got to sift through hundreds of thousands of applicants. And the easiest way for them to do that is honestly just to pick one thing that they choose. And I might not be right, but maybe it's 60% right. Now, is it wrong that they're eliminating 40% of the people and the candidates? Like probably, but for them, 60% is a better number. So they will eliminate 40% of people based solely on grades. And then after that, they might eliminate again until they get a number which is more manageable. So that's the big thing when it comes to getting a job at a university, as if you have a comp sci degree. What has more demand of jobs, backend or front end? I'd say they're about equal. It varies depending on where you work. Like in San Francisco, I would say the demand is about, I would say in San Francisco, there's more demand for front end. Just because it's been the heart of engineering for so long. So there's a lot of people from the 80s and 90s that did so much backend. So, they're not short of backend developers. The only problem, of course, is that every year more people come in and front end is easier to learn than back end. So you have a lot of new developers learning front end. But honestly, it depends on your region. That's the big thing. It really varies from region to region, whether or not there's more front end or back end. Let's see. What approach should one take to snap out of imposter syndrome and actually do a task for their job that has been postponed for weeks already because the programmer is paralyzed by fear? So I would say that if you don't really know how to do a task in your job, that's not necessarily a fault of yours. Coding is very complicated and it's difficult because if we took this out of coding and let's say we're building a house, let's say you're somebody who just learned how to put wood together, how to nail wood together. If they suddenly expect you to start mixing concrete and pouring walls and building foundation, that's just setting yourself up to the worker to fail, right? Coding is the exact same. You need to have almost like an apprenticeship in this industry where you are a junior that's working under a senior and the senior is guiding you, showing you the ropes, showing you how the code works, showing you all of these things. There's a lot about coding that gets misconstrued by people that are non-technical that run companies. Because people that are non-technical don't understand that it's a very complicated and difficult thing to learn. So what they might expect is just for you to learn it, but they don't understand that there's a lot of consequences for sending a junior up on a feature that they're not ready to tackle, right? There's snowball consequences later down the road. So I would say that if you're afraid, I would say seek help from a senior and ask them to help you figure out what you don't understand about tackling a new feature. That's the big thing I would say when it comes down to that. Do you need a degree in computer science to work in a front-end developer? Absolutely not. You don't. In fact, there's very little overlap in what you learn in a computer science degree and what you do in a front-end role. Could you go for freelancing while being on a paid job and bootstrapping your freelance experience? You can. You definitely can. If you can balance your own time, you can definitely do freelance projects on the side while you're working a paid job. Is web designer and front end combined in big companies? Absolutely not. Designers are always their own thing. You don't need to know design to build front end. Mostly when we talk about front end in today's day and age, we're talking about people that know how to use frameworks like React and Angular. And designers are not expected to know that, nor are people that know Angular and React expected to know how to design. React and Angular are very complex tools that are solving very complex problems on the front end. It's almost like you've taken what you would do on a in a back end application, and you've moved it to the front end. It's no longer the case anymore that front end is not a respected field. Like back before Angular 1, when Google created Angular 1, I would say that, yeah, that was definitely the case. Backend was seen as a much more complicated thing to do because all frontend was features. But as the web got stronger, as browsers became more powerful in their rendering engines, everybody suddenly started to realize that once you had more power on the front end, that meant that you could have more complexity on the front end. You could build much more complex apps on the front end and have a lot of the rendering and the computation handled by the browser. So think about it like that. If a lot of your machine power before was only in your backend, then the most complex code that, deals with the complexity is going to be on the backend. But if the power now is shifted to the front end, then the experience is always going to be better on the front end, because if I can render something on the front end rather than communicate to a back end for it to calculate and then send it back to the front end, I would always rather do it on the front end. And as browsers get more powerful, front end is only going to get more complex and more challenging, which means that the skills required of a front end developer is only going to be higher. So that's a big thing, right? Let's see. Any thoughts on other technologies? Elixir, Phoenix, Live View. So I've worked with Phoenix and Elixir before. I like them. They're much closer to Ruby in terms of their syntax, but it's just demand, right? The demand for it has not necessarily been there. And as interested as I am in these new technologies, I'm at a point in my career where I'm mostly working for really large companies that are tech first. So I just work on what they require me to work on. Like I work with technologies and products that they want me to have expertise in or to continue building expertise in. If a company wanted me to do something in Elixir and I've been there for a while and I trust their leadership, then absolutely, I would definitely learn it. But in this case, I just haven't come across that situation yet. What does your average first month at your first job look like as a web dev? This varies from company to company and what kind of company you work at. For big FAANG companies, your first month is practically all onboarding because they have very complicated systems and very complicated, even just like ways that they manage their code. And if that's the case, then, they are going to be pretty much onboarding you and making sure you're familiar with the product that you're working on. Smaller companies, they might actually just throw you into a product and just expect you to start swimming right away. It honestly depends. Like your first month, what it should be, the ideal first month for a developer should be that you are onboarded while starting to interact with the code base. Meaning that maybe you're paired up with a senior. They give you a small feature to work on, and the senior shows you an existing feature that's very similar to what you're going to build. They show you the ropes of how this feature fits into the rest of the application. They show you how the tests are written. They show you any documentation they might have. And generally speaking, in fact, they should even pair a program with you just to make sure that you actually understand what it is to build that first feature. At least that's how I would run the first month of working with like a junior developer. That's the best way for you to make sure that this developer is set up on a strong foundation before they even begin. So that's like the kind of thing that I would be looking for, at least as terms of the company I work at. We don't always get to choose though, right? So that's always hard, but I would say that that's the big thing. why don't I have coding videos in my YouTube channel? Because it's editing. I don't really know how to like edit like videos of me talking, like not through just the browser. I could, but if there's interest, I mean, I could definitely think about doing something like that. There's just so many projects, and it's really just about managing time and making sure that, I'm doing the best job at whatever it is that I'm doing. Let me see. How much time do we need to become good at coding? Great question. How much time do we need to become good at coding? So honestly, when it comes to coding, there's a thing called the first, I don't remember, it's either 3,000 hours or 10,000 hours. It's a big number though. It's like, but let's say 3,000. You will spend roughly 3,000 hours in this period where it's challenging, it's hard, you're constantly learning new things, you're constantly being mentally strained on figuring out that what you thought you didn't know was not even close to what you understood it to be, right? So there's a big thing with, so at one of my old companies, there was this philosophy that I have really taken to heart, and I want all of you to know. So there are 3 categories of knowledge, right? There's the things that you know, there's the things that you know that you don't know, and then there's the things that you don't know that you don't know. That last one is going to be the scariest thing, and it's the most challenging aspect. You are not trying to learn all of the things that you know that you don't know. That isn't as important, because the moment that you know, if you're certain that you don't know this thing, you at least know the boundaries of what it is that you don't know, right? And you know how to approach it. But when you don't even know that you don't know something, that thing doesn't even exist in your consciousness. And that thing is what might lurk its head all of a sudden, and your entire plans, your strategy completely collapses. So what you want to spend the most amount of time doing in your initial years as a developer is breaking through as much of that unknown as possible. You want to convert as much of that I don't know, all that stuff, into stuff that you know that you don't know. And in this process, as you do that, you also want to make sure that, of course, you're learning new things, right? But like, if let's say you know that you don't know backend, right? But you don't know what's in backend. You can't really even clarify all of those parts, right? You don't know what containers are. You don't know what gateways are. You don't know what APIs are. You don't know what a good API looks like. There's all of those nuances. You just want to, at least from a high level, understand the bits and pieces that are there. Now, do you need to know how to implement them at the low level? No, not necessarily. But, that's where you start converting what you don't know into what you know. But figuring out like the landscape is what I would say it means to take what you don't know into things that you know that you don't know. I know, hopefully that language isn't too confusing. I know I have a lot of international viewers, so I know the language might be kind of weird. Do coding bootcamps really help you land a job easier? Would you recommend doing one? So I actually did do a coding bootcamp when I first came into the industry. I wouldn't say that it helps you in the sense that like somebody's not going to look at you and be, oh, this guy did a bootcamp, that means that they're more prepared than this other person. Absolutely not. Juniors don't get that benefit of the doubt. The only thing that a coding bootcamp does for you is that it forces you to code every day for 3 months for 8 hours in an environment where you're given people that have experience in coding so they can help you not make some of these mistakes. That's the only benefit of a bootcamp, but you don't need one to get into the industry. I have lots of friends that are great developers who came in with just learning it on their own from completely unrelated backgrounds, right? Some came from finance, some came from accounting, some came from art even, right? One of the people I look up to the most in my career, he was a guitar teacher before he became a developer. He just happened to develop in the side, and he wanted to be a music star. Another one worked in restaurants, right? It's just like really open-ended. You don't need anything. You don't need the boot camp. I would say that the boot camp is only if you know that it's really hard for you to program a lot up front. Then maybe you want to spend the money and attend a boot camp that will force you to spend the time to code. It's really about self-control. I think that's what it is. And sometimes it's just about discipline and putting yourself in the environment that makes you more disciplined. It shows that it works for you. That's really what I would say it is. Let's see. I am in Canada right now, Toronto, Canada. I think with Corona, it's pretty rough for everybody, but Toronto's got a thriving tech environment, I would say, where I think we're in like the top 5 when it comes to tech. Toronto has a lot of big companies. We have a lot of big FANG companies have offices here too. So in Toronto, the market is really good. Let's see. Do I think that coronavirus is going to affect coding job market? Not necessarily. I think it will while it is right now, but it's interesting because the world has to shift. The world has to get used to this working from home thing, which means that there will be more and more previous industries or ways that we did things that need to now switch online. And the big thing about coding and the software industry, and I would say that the coding industry as a whole, is that it connects previously existing things that were happening to the modern web. So there's still a lot of industries that are doing things in an old school way that could be optimized with code. Because you gotta think about it like that, right? Coding is a paradigm. It's the modern world. It's not like suddenly there's going to be less opportunities for us to move the world forward, right? Coding is always going to be in demand. It's like a thing that we just have to have. It's like almost like manufacturing. Before we had manufacturing, before the Industrial Revolution, any of that stuff, when manufacturing became a thing, everyone was like, oh my God, this like new thing is so crazy. How many products can we put on a manufacturing line? Well, it turns out even today, we're still trying to put complex products on a manufacturing line, right? Handmade is only good when it comes to things that you like. But when machines get better than handmade, we always want to put that on a manufacturing line. And coding is very similar. You're just trying to take old school things and move it into the modern era. And that's why I don't think coding will be affected once Corona passes. If anything, we might see a bigger boom with coding. A lot of tech companies that are purely modernized, like Twitch, for example, are seeing massive increases in revenue because more people are spending time at home and spending time on Twitch watching things. So honestly, I think like that's the great thing about our industry. We're pretty rock solid. It might be harder to find, initially some jobs because a lot of these companies were working with companies that had to shut down or close. But in the long run, coding will be around. Like I wouldn't worry about that at all. And it's TensorFlow, or just switch to Python TensorFlow. What's the difference between the two? Machine learning, I would say you should definitely speak to our ZTM resident machine learning expert, which is both Andre. Oh my God, I'm having a brain fart right now. Or Daniel. So that's the thing, right? I would just make sure that you ask them for their specialization for advice on machine learning. I've only played with it myself. I've done the Coursera course on machine learning. And of course, I've watched some of Andre and Daniel's course. So I myself haven't worked that much in machine learning. I don't want to misguide you in my advice. As for the question, how to use effect to achieve component did mount. If we put square brackets as an arg and use effect, it is completely like component did mount. That looks less like a question and more like a statement. The use effect doc for component did mount is pretty simple. Yeah, if you're just trying to do a component did mount, just put an empty array. But I will say this. Honestly, hooks. So this is that question about use effect hook with React that the Falcon asked. You have to not look at hooks and lifecycle methods as if they're one-to-one. Hooks are meant to be a completely different way to tackle things that you want to fire throughout the lifespan of a component. You have to look at hooks in a completely different way than you look at life cycles. If you want to replace life cycles in a one-to-one way with Hooks, it's not going to work. You're going to come across a lot of nuances and edge cases that might make your code not work. So that's a big thing that I would say you got to be careful with. Just be very aware that when you're doing hooks, you should be reading the hooks documentation, and you should be reading the articles that Dan Abramov has written on each hook. If you look up Dan Abramov, he is the creator of Redux, and he's also one of the he's the face of React now. He's in Facebook's React team. And he writes a great blog called Overreacted, where he goes extremely in-depth in best practices and what the Facebook team intends React to do. So that's a big thing. I would definitely read his use effect blog article on that. So that's a big thing to be careful with. How do I approach towards solving a problem? I mean, what all factors you count on, and how do you go about it, the thought process? So when I am solving a problem, whether it's a feature or whether it's an architecture problem, usually I try and think about all of the constraints. Meaning I think about all of the things that matter when it comes to solving this problem. So I do a lot of research first into what it is that this feature needs to account for. I have to also make sure that I know everything about how this feature is going to be used. What data am I getting from? Like, essentially, that's the main thing. You just want to make sure that you understand all of the factors that are going to go into how you're going to even decide on what this feature needs to do. Once I have that, I will start building out from out to in, working on major parts of the feature first, right? Like the major pieces of logic. I would try to make sure that those pieces are rock solid and they follow best practices. Then I start connecting the things together, making sure they work. And along the way, I might write some tests to make sure that the core pieces of logic don't break. It really depends on what it is that I'm building. But the most important thing when it comes to problem solving is that you make sure you know all of the factors that go into it. Hopefully that answered your question. How was my first year when I jumped into the industry? So with my first year, I joined a pretty small startup of 8-9 people, and the engineering team was 4 people, but one person was working on a mobile app in Swift, and another was maintaining an Ruby on Rails app, and me and some other developer worked together on an Angular 1 app. Unfortunately, I was tasked to work on the Angular side of the application completely myself. The other developer mostly just did CSS and HTML stuff for that whole year. So my first year was challenging because I had to essentially build an app from scratch in Angular when Angular was kind of new. And this was before I even knew like what best practices were. So I was writing functions that were like 100 lines long. You know, there was so much complexity going on in them. It was just the nature of the company I joined. But the great thing about that company was that the people were really helpful if I asked questions. They spent a lot of time on helping me understand if I had any questions about how to build a feature or about how something in JavaScript worked or anything like that, or even like just general best practices. Of course, the problem is that when you work for a small company, you know, you're building features, it's a business. So I wasn't able to get as much out of it as I would have if I worked in maybe a more larger company where there was much more hand-holding in their process. But I don't regret it at all. I thought it was an absolutely great experience just to get my foot in the door. So that's the thing. You just want to make sure that you're gaining experience no matter where you work. And it's always easier to get work after once you have the first company. So that's the big thing, I would say. Let's suppose the market needs Angular and React. What to learn first, React or Angular? I would say you should probably learn React first because React teaches you. So I want to be careful about how I answer this question. So let's say you didn't have a choice between Angular and React, right? Let's say that your market only, like let's say 80% of companies are hiring for Angular. Then you should definitely learn Angular because your main focus is to get a job first, right? Before like even focusing on what to learn. If you had to choose between React and Angular though, and there was equal opportunity for both, I would say learn React from a purely technical level because React is almost just JavaScript. There's a thin component generating library that React represents that helps you connect these components to your code, right, that you've written. But it's all in a very JavaScripty manner. Angular, on the other hand, is a much more fleshed out code base that has a lot of complexity in it and a lot of what people call angularisms, which means that you are pretty much just working and learning Angular. You're doing Angular and you're getting better at Angular, and those Angular skills don't necessarily transfer to your knowledge of JavaScript one-to-one the way that like React does. Does that make sense? Angular definitely has its place in the market, and it's got great value for large enterprises because of these exact things that I mentioned, where if you have a really large engineering team, everybody has to know Angular's way of doing things, which means that generally speaking, your code base doesn't deviate that much from, team to team if they're all working on the same product. But React, on the other hand, has a lot of variance because it's just JavaScript, which means that you can have people coding features one way and another team coding features another way. So you might get a lot of variability in your code base, which means that it's harder for people to switch working on one feature to another, or it might be harder for a new developer to come on and try and figure out what the best practice to work on this React project is, because maybe this team is using RxJS observable. That team, the previous company that you worked at was working MobX. The next company you work at is working React Redux, right? Or this other team is doing context API. Like there's just like, it depends. You suddenly have to learn something new, even though it's still React. But of course your JavaScript skills are much better, so you still can figure it out. Whereas Angular, you go from team to team to team to team, company to company, company to company. Angular is like practically the same everywhere. It's there's of course deep variation in the libraries that you use on an Angular project, but it's not so significant that it's like, oh my god, this is something I've never seen before, right? Everything, once you understand how Angular works, pretty much works in how Angular works, even the libraries that get used. Yeah, I mean, so thank you for everyone that took my courses. Yeah, I love that. Such a positive response to the courses so far. Let's see. Android versus web development. It really differs, honestly. The big thing with mobile development versus web development is that there's room for both. It's really just about what you're interested in. A lot of people know right out that they want to build apps, whereas some other people don't interact with their mobile that much. So then they're just like, oh, I'm not even interested. I would say that there's need for both. It's just really up to you in terms of whether you want to do Android or web development. When it comes to blogs, vlogs, and resources, somebody earlier asked me for books as well. With books and blogs and vlogs, Dan Abramov's blog Overreacted for React is fantastic. I can't remember the names of some of these people because I just have them in my bookmarks. There are some pretty good JavaScript blogs on Medium. One is by, I believe it's Elliot's. I don't want to get this wrong. Let me just find this. With blogs and vlogs, with blogs and books. Books, I would say JavaScript, the good parts, clean code. Like they're pretty much general. Any of those books that everyone recommends, I would say is pretty good to go with. I wouldn't really even worry too much about, making sure you read all the right stuff. I think it's Eric Elliott. Let me just make sure. Yes, Eric Elliott. I like his blogs on Medium. Those I find to be very good. Let me just put that here. So when it comes to frameworks, do I think React will survive the next 10 plus years? Honestly, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I think it might because a lot of companies have committed to it. And you have to remember, React is backed by one of the largest web companies in the world that have scaled front end in a way that other companies probably haven't. If you think about the most used web app, it's probably Facebook. Yes, everyone uses Google, but Google is less appy, whereas React is really heavy on the app usage. That's not to say, and plus, like, React has its legs running right now, which means that Facebook is dedicating a ton of resources into making sure that React stays positive. The big thing that I could see that might change is if we look at the trend of how front-end frameworks became big in the first place. Let's say that, okay, so in 2009, browsers got this massive upgrade because the spec changed, computers got more powerful, and Google set out to move a lot of what I mentioned before, which was back-end complexity and rendering onto the front end on these more powerful browsers, which meant that there needed to be some kind of framework that helped manage all of these complexities so that developers could work on just what's important, which was the components, right? The visual aspect, the rendering, the data management, all of that stuff. If suddenly there's a really big change in the technology in such a way that there needs to be more, I don't even know, like, let's say, for example, suddenly the browser team figures out a way to make multi-threaded JavaScript, a multi-threaded JavaScript engine. Because right now, the JavaScript engine is single-threaded, right? The V8 engine is single-threaded. If that were the case, I could see how there might be a new language or even a new paradigm, framework, whatever, on the front end all of a sudden, because now it becomes that the bottleneck of performance just gets demolished and the net gains we get become astronomical, right? It's undeniable. Another thing that I could see is that because there's so many frameworks out there right now, big companies need to make sure that they're able to share components, which are, you know, the visual bits of code that represent the view layer and the data management, whatever, right? They need to be able to spread that across multiple applications that might be written in different languages. If that were the case, then suddenly web components becomes more popular as well. If that takes, you know, it's steadily gaining more and more traction every year, web components. If you haven't heard of it, web components is a way to essentially write reusable components in basic JavaScript, like vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, the same way you would write an Angular component, a Vue component, or a React component, but you can plug it and drop it into any framework and have it work. You can wrap it in Angular, you can wrap it very easily in React, wrap it in Vue, and it just works, right? So that's the only other new technology I could see going. I don't know if I want to say that React will still be around for 10 years. I can definitely see it, but I can't guarantee it. Can I see a new framework taking over? I definitely can. Absolutely. Because there's a lot of problems philosophically that need to be solved on front end. So like those are the things that kind of you got to see, like whether or not that'll happen. That's probably the big thing I would say. But it definitely has immense value for the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think it'll change in that sense. Do I think that JavaScript will evolve? Absolutely. JavaScript is constantly changing. Do I think it'll be as big of a change as ES6 was? Because ES6 was a big change in JavaScript in the sense that we got a lot of quality of life improvements with our syntax. But do I think anything else that big will happen? Probably. I just don't know when it'll happen. But generally speaking, JavaScript is still going to be around in the same capacity just because so many apps, like at the end of the day, everything needs to be backwards compatible, and so many things are built in the old JavaScript, right? Let's see. What is the meaning behind saying if it can be written in JavaScript, it will be? So there's a funny joke that says that if Skynet, if you guys don't know Skynet was the robot AI that took over in the Terminator movies that kind of brought about the apocalypse. It's maybe less funny because I have to explain it, but they say that if Skynet ever became a thing, it would be written in JavaScript, and that's because JavaScript is such a popular language. That's probably just what it is, right? There's so many people that do JavaScript, you can never get away from JavaScript. Any other language can honestly be replaced except for JavaScript, at least right now, because no matter what, backends can be written in anything you want. You can write it in Ruby, you can write it in C, you can write it in Java, you can write it in Python, right? You can write it in JavaScript, but on the front end, if you want to work in front end, you have to know JavaScript. You can't not use JavaScript for the browser, and the browser is the main thing. There are people that have tried to create new languages, but none of them have taken off. It just doesn't work like that. It's got too much traction. Too many people are committed and invested in their skills in JavaScript. There's that human element of it that just won't change, which is that in that sense, JavaScript's going to be around. So that's really what it means when it comes to if it can be written, but in JavaScript, it will be. Best tech stack? Man, that's a really hard question because there's trade-offs to everything. There's no such thing as one best technology. There's no such thing as one best framework. There's no such thing as one best language. Every language has trade-offs, whether they're technical or whether they're human. In that sense, like it really comes down to evaluating the needs of the product and the needs of the company. If we're evaluating what the best tech stack to use is for that solution. So that's like a big thing, I would say. It's really hard to say if there's one big best company, honestly. What you think limitations of React, where it might have to do well compared to any of its competitors. Okay, limitations of React. I mentioned this earlier when I talked about Angular. The big limitation of React is that the learning curve of React is both low and high. There's a lot of React ecosystem to learn. It's not just about learning React, it's about learning the libraries that React can use. And there's a lot that have pretty equal popularity. Now, Redux is much more popular than MobX, yes, but MobX has enough market share that there's a chance you'll come across a company that uses MobX while you're working in React. And in that sense, now you have to learn this MobX library, how it fits into the architecture of React, right? And let's talk about even like asynchronous event handling in Redux. Some people use sagas, which is really popular. Some people write really complex thunks, which is not the right thing to do, but some companies have committed down that road and you have to go along with it. Some companies have written all their code in observables. Like there's a lot more variance in React and its massive ecosystem. And because it's so popular and so scaled, you might have to learn a lot of different things. And for a company that's evaluating using a product like React, let's say they're a big company, right? They might have to invest a lot more upfront work, making sure that everybody follows guidelines and stays within guidelines of how to build an application. But that means that you have to have a very mature leadership team in not only the engineering side, but also the decision-making side. Because that upfront cost of time to making sure that, those best practices are assimilated throughout the rest of the company, everybody follows these best practices. All of these factors that go into it become a huge breaking point on a company evaluating whether or not to use React and how useful React is to this company. Now, that's not to say that it's such an overwhelmingly large thing, but it is a factor for a lot of enterprise companies who don't have those resources yet. They might choose to go with a company like, choose to go with a framework like Angular because Angular, as I mentioned, does pretty much everything in the Angular way. I'd say 80-90% of the things in Angular are pretty much Angular. And generally speaking, there's pretty much the exact same ecosystem libraries that everyone uses in Angular. So you're probably, if you work on an Angular project, you're working on the same Angular libraries, same Angular paradigms, same Angular code base. That's the big thing I would say about Angular that you have to keep in mind. That's the benefit. With Vue, it's a little bit more performant than React, because its diffing layer is a little bit faster. Of course, this depends from feature to feature, complexity to complexity. And it's really lightweight. It's really easy to get started with Vue, like much easier because it's a little closer to just like basic JavaScript. It's kind of like if you took Angular 1 and you took React and you made a baby with it. But like benefits, I haven't used React enough. I haven't used Vue enough at scale to say. I've done Angular and React to massive scale, but I haven't done Vue to really large scale. I've only done it for smaller personal projects that get some like low level traffic. So I can't really tell you like building really complex features in Vue. But that's what I would say about at least React versus Angular. Let's see. WebAssembly. I don't really know about the hybrid languages. I haven't explored them myself. I don't want to give you the wrong advice there. So that's probably what I would say about, WebAssembly or Python. I didn't even know that was a thing, Python in the browser. That's kind of funny. Yeah, honestly, I don't know much about those. Do I work with a team? Yeah, I tend to work with teams as far as like when I work on projects. Even with Zero to Mastery, our team is like 6-7 people. So yeah, I very pro teamwork. It's very hard to do anything great on your own. That's at least my perspective. So we're coming to the end of the time now. If anybody has any last minute questions, please ask away. Otherwise, I think I'm going to end this stream in 3 minutes. So LinkedIn profile, if you're a developer, it doesn't matter that much. Honestly, with LinkedIn, it's just going to be, you're communicating two things. Either that you're really organized, like if you have really meticulously written things in your LinkedIn profile in terms of what you did at every job you've been at. Or, I've seen people that just have the companies with, developer, engineer, and they get to Google, they get to Facebook, they get to Amazon. It doesn't matter. It's all very structured in a way. Honestly, like most recruiters, they kind of just look at it, and they just see like where have you worked, right? How much experience do you have? And that's pretty much all they need to gauge. No one's really reading through it that thoroughly when it comes to LinkedIn, at least most of the time. So with LinkedIn, I would just say that if you were to write a lot about what you did at each role, just be very results oriented. Like mention actionable things that you did, like whether or not you brought up test coverage from like 68% to like 90%, right? You got to be very, very concrete so that a person reading it immediately sees what value you brought to that company. Does age matter on your first job? It doesn't really. As long as you can prove that you can do the work, there might be a company that hires you. At least for as far as the work goes. Some companies, they might be a little bit more ageist in the sense that they might want you to be more mature, or they might want you to be more, they might want you to be younger if you're like really old and they're worried about whether or not you know enough of the proper technology. But anybody has to prove a point. I think that's the main thing. Yeah, no, okay. Yeah, no, so thank you everyone. Thank you everybody for participating in this live stream. I will try to put up the video for anybody that missed it. But thank you everyone. You got some great questions. Thank you everyone for participating, and I hope to interact with you guys again, whether it be through the Discord, through courses, or through another live stream.